All right, you can see my slides. Excellent. All right, thank you all for joining today. We had a couple different iterations change because we had some things come up. So let's go ahead and start off. I am Nikki Copa. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm the broker of record and the Chief Compliance Officer for Century 21 Affiliated. I am in Southern California, in San Diego, Riverside, and Orange counties. I have had the privilege of being a C.A.R. director since 2008. One of the awesome things about that is that I was able to work on the Standard Forms Advisory Committee. I did a 3-year stint at one point in time where I was the member in 2014. Vice chair in 2015, then I was the chair in 2016. I mention this simply because this was where I really learned and fell in love even more with every single form. I got to hear a lot about the background and how this came to be, why we're making this change, what we need, how people are explaining things in the fields. And so I truly became a forms junkie. I am on the Standard Forms Advisory Committee again. I am the vice chair this year. So this has been an interesting time, as you might imagine. We have an NAR settlement that had certain things that were required. Then we were looking at industry discussions that actually would lead into some other things too. The last thing that I do want to hit on before I get going is that I am also a candidate for 2627 C.A.R. treasurer. All right, so let's get into the meat of this. We have C.A.R. had announced that they were going to delay the release of the settlement related forms. Those were originally due to be released in June, on June 25th. Because there had been some noise in the media. The CFA had weighed in, said that they didn't like our forms. We had also seen some different things with the Department of Justice. And then the Department of Justice actually sent formal inquiry asking about some of our forms. Okay, so with that, I don't know what that inquiry said, but we knew that the Department of Justice had already publicly stated that they really wanted to see a decoupling of broker compensation, no more broker to broker cooperating compensation. This was something that the DOJ had talked about for a while. You might remember that the Department of Justice entered into an agreement. They did an investigation that started back in 2018. And with that, then when they entered into a settlement agreement with NAR that they then reneged on. So all of that being said, even with the NAR settlement in place, we also had to look at the fact that we had other challenges that were out there. So with all of that, the legal department at C.A.R. decided that the best thing for us to do would be to remove the references to cooperating broker compensation from our forms. It was the best way to mitigate future risk for all of us. And personally, I think it was a brilliant move. So with that, that's what you're going to hear a lot about today, and that's where you're going to see a shift in a lot of the things that we did. Now I'm going to ask one more time, please don't raise your hands, okay? All right, so all of this is based off of, it all started with the settlement agreement that requires that we do practice changes starting August 17th. These new forms that you're going to see today that we're going to be talking about will be releasing on July 24th. Okay, so they will be available in our forms programs for use on July 24th. They are available right now if you go to CAR.org. Okay, there's also free training from CAR on the buyer side and on the listing side that you can access for free. It's a $50 value for the class that you can get for free if you go to CAR.org. You're going to see a banner up at the top that talks about the settlement related forms. Click on that. It'll take you to a bunch of interesting resources. Okay. Now, one of the things that we want to remember is that this settlement agreement, it covers every single one of us as agents. It covers brokers. It covers MLSs, and it covers local associations. It says that we cannot be sued again for the same thing as long as we make changes to our practices. That's why your MLS rules have to change some. That's why our forms have to change some, so that we are all in compliance with the settlement agreement and we truly make the practice changes that are required. Okay, so I had originally said that this was going to be 16 forms. Then we saw a few things change back and forth. This is what I'm going to cover today, the broker compensation advisory. In my opinion, this is kind of like your Bible for how to have these conversations. C.A.R. did an amazing job of kind of making the conversation flow. So I'm going to walk through that with you. Then we're going to talk about the listing agreement and the forms that are associated with your listing agreement. Buyer representation, obviously, throughout throughout California, there are many areas where this form was just not used. So it's new to a lot of us. There are 8 different forms involved, and we are going to cover all of them. Also, open houses. All right, so what are the rules now? We have 2 forms that I'm going to cover under that particular thing. Then we're going to go into the purchase agreement, how to talk about compensation in the purchase agreement, and the forms that you can utilize for that. Last but not least, and I haven't covered this before because this was a newer form that C.A.R. did develop when they did the revisions. Tenant representation form and the lease listing agreement and how that changed. Okay, so I will go over those briefly too at the end. And yes, I will try to keep my speed down. I will try not to talk too fast. I will make sure that we try and get through all of this within 90 minutes, and then we're able to do Q&A for the last 30. All right, so let's start off with the broker compensation advisory. Like I said, the layout on this is great. It starts off talking to sellers. So, Mr. Seller, I need to let you know that compensation is not fixed by law. It is fully negotiable. You're going to see that phrase repeatedly through all of these forms. One of the big reasons for that is because it's required. Under the terms of the settlement agreement, we have to make sure that we tell all sellers, all buyers, that compensation is not fixed by law and it is fully negotiable. Now, does that mean that I have to accept whatever they're willing to pay me? No, it means I get to negotiate my worth. So I need to be able to articulate my value. Okay, so this is going to start walking us through. One of the things that this said is, Mr. Seller, okay, compensation negotiation should focus on agent value and the services they provide. So remember, just like in a listing agreement, we're usually in a presentation and we work to try to make sure that we are articulating our value. All right. So then next paragraph down, again, we're still talking to the sellers here. One of the things that we're saying to the seller is that sometimes buyers want to represent themselves. Okay. If that happens, then me as your listing agent, I would have to do more work. So I may ask for more compensation if the buyer decides to represent themselves and there is no buyer's agent representing them. Okay, so that's what this paragraph explains. Then this goes into, all right, so Mr. Seller, remember right now I'm signing an agreement with you. I have no idea who's going to bring the buyer. But if it is somebody from my company and it is dual agency, okay, then we'll let you know that when the time comes. The other thing in this is it does say, Mr. Seller, here's the deal. If it is dual agency, okay, broker is going to be compensated for each side. Whatever I negotiate with you, Mr. Seller, right now is only for the selling side of the transaction. All right, then it moves on to talking to buyers. Okay, so buyers, once again, we're saying compensation not fixed by law, fully negotiable, right? Buyer agrees to pay the buyer's broker if the transaction closes. So this is not an upfront fee. This is just like we do with listings. So when the seller is paying compensation, it's at close of escrow through right? So this will be the same thing with our buyers. Then we go in and say, this is when your buyer says, but wait a minute, Nikki, I've bought lots of property. I've never had to sign an agreement before. I'm not interested in signing an agreement. Well, Actually, it's a requirement now. So this gives you the language to talk through the fact that the settlement agreement requires that whenever we work with a buyer, before we show them property, we must have a representation agreement in place. That is a term of the settlement agreement. It is also going to become an MLS rule for most MLSs. Okay, so that will be an MLS rule for all of us that subscribe to the MLS. The other thing too is there is legislation that we do expect to be passed and go into effect on January 1 that will require a buyer representation agreement be in place, okay, under California law. So this is where if they say, hey, you know what, I never had to do this before, this is where we can say, this is why it's a good idea. It is required. Okay. The other thing that this paragraph talks about is that me, as the buyer's agent, I cannot receive any more compensation than what is in our written agreement. Okay. So that's another place where it says that. Then we say the other thing with that too, it is required, but here are some advantages. One of the great things about doing an agreement is that it sets clear mutual expectations. You, buyer, will know exactly what it is that to expect from me, and I can set expectations for the transaction. The other thing about that too is it also helps you kind of articulate your value, taking them through. When we look at the buyer representation agreement, there are lots of different talking points where you can give examples of your experience that will truly build your value for these buyers. Okay. All right. So then the third part. Now we've talked to the sellers. We've said, here's what compensation is. We've talked to the buyers. We've talked to them about the agreement and compensation. Now we say, okay, but how does this work? Okay. How can the buyer's agent be paid? Okay. Couple different ways, 3 different ways. Okay. One is pursuant to the buyer rep agreement. My buyer signs the agreement, agrees to pay me, and that buyer brings that money into escrow and pays me directly. Okay, so that can certainly happen. It's at close of escrow. Okay, but they can also agree to include a negotiable term in the contract. Okay, so they could make a conditional offer to the seller, including a term asking the seller to pay the buyer's agent or the buyer's compensation obligation. Okay, so they can do that. This is what explains that, the next paragraph down. Okay, now one of the things a couple things to remember here is I have a lot of agents that'll say, but wait a minute, Nikki, I don't want to negotiate my buyer side compensation in the contract. We're not supposed to do that, right? We're not doing that. We've already sat down with our buyer. We have signed an agreement, and our buyer and the agent have decided and negotiated compensation. In the contract, the buyer is simply stating, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm willing to pay X amount for your property. I'm willing to close in 30 days. Oh, and I'm also going to ask you to pay my broker compensation obligation. It's one of many terms in the contract. Okay. There is another way that this can happen too, and this is not going to happen all that often. The best way to imagine this is as a FSBO seller. So let's say we've got a seller that is unrepresented. Okay, as the buyer's agent, I can approach that seller and do something usually like a single property compensation agreement, okay, that I would put into place asking that seller to go ahead and pay the buyer's obligation. All right, now this is where, the seller's going, but wait a minute, Nikki, last time I sold, I offered compensation in the MLS. Why aren't we doing that anymore? Or the buyer saying, I've never had to sign an agreement and I never had to pay my buyer's agent before. Why is all this changing? Well, C.A.R. kind of put together a nice little, historically, we used an MLS, okay? There was a settlement agreement, there was a lawsuit, there was a settlement agreement. We can no longer do that in the MLS. So under the terms of the settlement agreement and through the discussions in the lawsuit, it was determined by the courts or by the jury that buyers and sellers want to be able to negotiate their own agent's compensation. Okay, so here we are. That's exactly what can happen now. It will no longer be cooperating compensation back and forth. All right, so let's jump into, right now it's all theoretical, right? Let's jump into the forms because that's when it really makes more sense. Now, this I can go over fairly quickly. This is our disclosure and modification to the listing agreement. This is going to be important if you have a listing in the MLS right now. It's an active status, okay? It is actively being marketed in your MLS. And the time comes where they remove the cooperating compensation field, okay? It's important that you reach out to your seller and say, hey, seller, we're going to need to modify the agreement that we have. Our current listing agreement that we have access to right now states that we are going to cooperate with other brokers using the MLS with cooperating compensation. Once that field goes away, or when the 17th comes around, whichever's earlier, then we will no longer be able to do that. So in that case, we do need to modify our agreement. So that's what this form is for. It's boilerplate language to let them know the why, and that we will go ahead and make the modifications to the listing agreement. All right, so let's jump into our listing agreement. Remember when we went to the grid format in the purchase agreement and everybody was like, whoa, that looks so different. It made it longer. Oh, we've all really leaned into it and we all like it now because all of our terms that can be written in are all in a grid, okay? Standard Forms Advisory Committee said, hey, let's do that for all of our main agreements. So we do it for our purchase agreement. Okay. Now we're going to be doing it for our listing agreement and also our buyer representation agreement. Okay. So our new listing agreement, we start off with same things that we saw before. Okay. Now you will note that it says seller should read all 7 pages. That's a lot of pages, right? Definitely has been an increase. There's a couple reasons for that. It actually didn't get a whole lot longer as far as the language in it, but we did, whenever you put it in a grid, then you are going to need more space because it's just more difficult to format. The other thing that C.A.R. really took notice of was there was a lot of negative chatter in the media basically stating that our forms were very difficult to read, that they were confusing, there was a lot of language, and it was just too hard to read. So you'll notice, just look on this graphic, there's a lot more white space, okay? So when you double space or single space between lines, you can see that there's a lot more white space now, and that is to make it a little bit more pleasing to the eye and easier for people to read. That being said, it also made it longer. So with that, yes, it is 7 pages, but it's not actually that it's all that content. All right, so we jump into it. Here's our grid. This is the first part of it. We're going to talk about the listing period, beginning on whatever date and ending at 11:59 p.m. on whatever date. Okay. Once again, with the new law in California, a listing for a natural person cannot exceed 24 months. LLC, corporation, that's different. Just a natural person. Then we put in listing price. Okay. We can put in our listing price there. Then we can go through, remember if we have a probate sale or maybe we have a manufactured home sale, then we had a checkbox in our listing agreement and the addendum would populate into our transaction. Same thing here because again, it's something that we can check. So we've got the check boxes there. Okay. Then we go into the biggie, compensation. So obviously this is so different than what we're used to. Starts off with the ever popular compensation. The amount of commissions is not fixed by law. It is negotiable. Okay. So that is what we start off with in paragraph C, 2C. Then we go into 2C1, compensation to seller's broker. And you're going to note it says only seller's side of transaction. Okay. That's important. The whole concept of total compensation and then splitting it between brokers or assigning a value to each of the sides, that's gone. That was part of the cooperating compensation conversation. Now, when I I go down and sit down with my seller. I'm saying to them, this is how amazing I am. This is why you should hire me. This is all the marketing I'll do, all the homes I've sold, and this is what I charge. Okay. And I'm able to fill that in. And it does have the spots for transaction fees or whatever else you normally would write in your listing agreement. So it has spots for all of that. Then remember in the buyer compensation advisory or broker compensation advisory that we just went over, there was that second paragraph that says, if the buyer is unrepresented, then there may be additional compensation to the listing agent. So if I'm sitting with my seller and I have just said, okay, this is what I work for, we filled in a number to C1, okay? Then I say, if the buyer decides to represent themselves, I'm going to need to do a lot more work. Therefore, I would charge an additional percentage for that. And I can write that in there, or I cannot do it. Doesn't matter. It's not required, but it is an option. Okay. Then continuation of right to compensation for broker identified prospective buyers. What is that? Okay, that's our safety clause that we have in our contract right now. So in our listing agreement, if you look, it says if blank days after the expiration or cancellation of this agreement, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that is what a lot of us refer to as our safety clause. It's after the expiration or cancellation of the agreement. If somebody that I brought to the property as your listing agent ends up buying the property, that I would be able to be compensated. So same thing. We just made it a little bit shorter and a little bit easier to understand. So it's that same contractual agreement. The continuation period shall be blank calendar days. So that's where that is. Then seller obligation to pay previous brokers. This would really come into play. The best example of this is, let's say that my seller called me. They just canceled another listing agreement with another broker. I'm going to say, all right, can you send me that cancellation of listing? Because I need to see if you have an obligation to pay that previous broker, and if there are any attached people to that, so that I can exclude them out of mine. So if that was the case, let's say they signed a cancellation agreement agreeing to pay that other broker, that previous broker, 25%, okay, of a 25% referral fee, then I would know that, and this is where we would write that in. So that's what that term is about. Then we get into all this stuff that we're already used to. There's no new options, okay? They're just all conveniently located in the grid. So items included, items excluded, leased or liened items, okay? Then we go through smart home features. This is always all those things that you want to talk about at your listing agreement, okay? Then we go into MLS. All right, again, we're in our grid, so it's all kind of a little bit smaller. Property will be marketed in the following MLS. You put your primary, just like we did before, okay? Then it says C.A.R. form MLSA. This is a new form, okay? Remember all that language in our listing agreement that says why use an MLS, the value of an MLS, why you should use the MLS, all that good stuff. It's been taken out of our listing agreement and it's in this new form, the MLSA. We are going to go over it, okay? And it is bundled with our new listing agreement when it releases on the 24th, okay? So we write in the primary. Then we say, all right, if there was always this option that seller could instruct the broker not to take photographs. I'm not sure why they would want to do that, but the option still remains. It's just been moved to the grid. All right, then we have the same type of thing. Again, all of this language that was in the body of our listing agreement, it's just been moved to the grid. Timing and presentation of offers. Remember, the default is that I, as the seller's agent, will present all offers as soon as practicable. Or the seller could instruct me, all right, Nikki, I want you to put it on the MLS on Thursday. And then I don't want to see any offers until Monday at 5 o'clock. Okay, so I can write that in. if that's what my seller instructs me to do. Okay, then we go on to buyer love letters, right? We've all seen those. Remember, the default is seller instructs broker not to present any buyer letters. Okay. Or if your seller says, I totally want to see them, I understand the risks of potential discrimination claims, I don't care, I want to see them, you can check the box. Seller instructs broker to present all buyer letters. Okay. Then we have all the list of investigations and reports that we had before. It's just all in the grid because, again, we could check any of those boxes. All right, exceptions to ownership and title, that was always in there before, no new things here. Seller opt-out for key safe and lockbox, that is there. Sign, that's there. It's just all been moved to the grid. And then, of course, remember we added a little while back that you can check the box that seller intends to include a contingency to purchase a replacement property. Okay, so you can check that box as well. So all of that is there. And then additional terms. So that is everything that can be written in to the listing agreement is now all conveniently located in our nice little grid. Okay, now, just like with our purchase agreement, in our purchase agreement, we have everything in the grid, but then if you want additional explanations for some of the things that are located in the grid, then you can refer to the body and the more intense language parts of the contract. So we've got the same thing here, and we're only going to hit on the things that really change, not the entire agreement, because we just don't have that long. So advisories and addenda. You're going to see that the C.A.R form BCA, broker compensation advisory, is hard checked. That will be included with our listing agreement and with our buyer representation agreement. So it's hard checked in both of them. But let's say you had an REO, it was a trust sale, whatever. You could also check a box for that to add it. All right. Then we go into compensation, and these are our explanations of compensation. Remember, that's changed from what we're used to doing, right? Commission includes all compensation and fees. So that is, whatever the commission may be. And if there's additional transactional fees, that is all what encompasses the definition of compensation. Okay. So seller agrees to pay the number in the grid to the seller's agent. Seller agrees to pay any additional amount in 2C2. That was the spot where we write in if a buyer is unrepresented. Okay, so here's the explanations for those if you want to read through them just as you're working on understanding your new scripting for when you're talking to a seller. Compensation terms, okay? Compensation is earned. If the seller, this is the same stuff that we saw before. So literally, if you look on the screen, you see the red stuff, that anything in red is what is what has changed. All the black language, all of that was already in our listing agreement. So again, they reorganized some things. They did some bullet pointing to make it a little bit easier to read, but no real changes to that. Okay. Then we go into the safety clause. Here was the explanation for that safety clause that we already talked about that's in the grid. So continuation of right to compensation for broker procured buyer. Remember, you have to make your list, all of that stuff. You don't really have to look at this because this doesn't happen all that often. But if your seller decides to wants to cancel, or you're coming up on your expiration, you want to revisit this paragraph because it walks you through what you need to do to make sure that you can get your list over to the seller and you would be entitled to compensation. All right, again, you can see that the language is black. It's just the headings that change. Seller interference with listings. So it makes it a little bit easier to understand where certain definitions and certain contractual terms are located. But there was no actual change to the terms, just rearranging and reformatting. So you can see the bullet points there. All right. And then again, instead of this being a big long paragraph for paragraph F there, they put them out in some bullet points just to make it a little bit easier to read through. Okay. Now, this is where you say to seller, all right, seller, do you have any other obligation to any other broker? Do you have a cancellation? Do you have a referral fee agreement? Anything? If so, you do need to list them in the grid in 2C4. Okay. Then this explains that the maximum listing period under the law is 24 months for a natural person. Okay. Leased or not liened. It's kind of interesting because I've watched this language evolve over the years. Now we've also got the explanation of what we mean is it's not owned by you. Okay. So that language is in there to make it abundantly clear what we are talking about. And you're going to see that there is some red language here. One of the things that's included is seller will provide copies of all lease or obligating documents to the buyer, which we always knew that they needed to, but this is a reminder for us when we're sitting in our listing agreements to ask the seller for that stuff because they never can find it, right? So we want to get ahead of it and ask them to get that stuff right up front, okay? And then smart home features. It includes everything, and it does set the expectation that all smart home features are intended to stay unless they exclude them. This is where we're talking about the Ring doorbell, the smart light bulbs, the thermostat, all that stuff, okay? All right. Then we go into the explanation of presentation of offers, right? Maybe we're going to do that delay. Nikki, I want to list on Thursday, but I don't want to see offers until Monday. Okay. So we're talking about that and how that might help the seller and how that may handicap them. But this is also the spot where they are including that some buyers may not be able or allowed to pay their compensation obligation to the buyer's broker. Okay. So this is where we can have the conversation. We already went through and established what my compensation is as the listing agent, right? But I can say to them, I want to set expectations for what you might see. Okay. Buyers may write a lowball offer. Buyers agents may be late for their appointments, right? Buyers may want to look in all of your closets and all of your cupboards. These are all the things that we set expectations for, right? This is what we'll do too, to set that expectation. There are a lot of buyers, they're not used to having to pay their own agent. They may not be able to, or they may ask you to pay the obligation because they want to use those funds to do some repairs to the home or whatever. So this paragraph kind of walks you through that language. All right. This is where we now have new language that says, Mr. Seller, you need to understand that agents must have a buyer representation agreement in order to show a property. Okay. Also says that seller will consent to me entering into an agreement with the buyer that may write an offer on your property that would result in dual agency. Okay, this is important because of some of the terminology, and I'll go deeper into this when we talk about the open house forms, okay, and the settlement terms. Unrepresented buyer, okay, this says if the buyer is unrepresented and they refuse to have representation, the seller authorizes me to obtain a signature on either the form buyer non-agency, form BNA, or if this is at an open house, the open house non-agency sign-in form. And again, we're going to cover that. This is important because of the dynamics with California Department of Real Estate regulations, what they want us to say and make clear to buyers and sellers, and also with the terms of the settlement agreement. All right. So remember we were back, now we're through the listing agreement, but back in the listing agreement, it said C.A.R form MLSA, right? So let's jump into that form. This is a new form, so all the language is black, okay? But you'll notice, what is an MLS? This used to be in our listing agreement. What information is provided to the MLS? All of this stuff was in our listing agreement before. It's just been pulled out of there and put into its own form. So this is all the same thing. Benefits of using the MLS, clear cooperation policy, public marketing, all of that good stuff. Okay. You also have the option. This is where you can say seller does authorize or does not authorize the broker to market the property per the coming soon status if your MLS has a coming soon status. The default is you're allowed to use it, okay, not prevented. Then this is where we get into timing. So when I take a listing now, very rarely do I go home and put it on the MLS because I have not had my photographer out there. I haven't done my drone footage. I haven't done all of the stuff for the marketing, right? You usually sign the listing agreement, and oftentimes you're not going to get it on the MLS until all of the photos are done and you have all of the materials prepped. So this is where you're going to check the box. Seller instructs broker to begin marketing the property to the public on blank date. Okay, so that's where you write that in. Previously, we were able to do that in our listing agreement, or we could attach an SELM. So now we can do it in the MLS form. Okay. The other thing we can do is we can also say seller instructs broker not to market the property to the public at all in the MLS. We're going to totally exclude it. So there's a checkbox for that as well. There's also the checkbox for if clear cooperation does not apply. If you belong to an MLS that does not have to adhere to the clear cooperation policy, then you can certainly check that box. All right, now we're going into this big conversation about concessions. Different things about concessions. When we went into the settlement agreement, then it was clear that per the terms of the settlement agreement, that sellers were allowed to still offer concessions, credits, okay? If I'm just using a loose term, credits to the buyer's agent, okay? Or I'm sorry, to the buyer, not to the agent. Very specifically, concessions are between the seller and the buyer. So if that's the case, let's explain what concessions are. There was also a conversation out there that many people felt that including concessions in the MLS was just a way to skirt the rule changes that are required by the settlement agreement. So it started getting frowned upon a little bit. So C.A.R. now has laid out, here are the explanations of what concessions are. So you can talk to your client about them. A couple things that I want to point out here, concessions in the MLS are not promises, okay? That is something that is an offer. If we think about it, pretty much everything in the MLS is only an offer, and it's not real until it's in our purchase agreement, right? So in the MLS, if I say the refrigerator is included, does that mean that it automatically is included? No, not unless it's referenced in the purchase agreement, and our purchase agreement says that. So remember that this would be the same thing. So we're shifting away for the way that we've always worked is in the MLS. If I had something in the MLS, there was a promise and an obligation to pay the other side. These are no longer promises, and they're no longer obligating the seller. Okay. So this is kind of a nice thing for that seller to understand, because we did have sellers that were frustrated thinking that they were obligated to pay cooperating compensation to an agent they didn't know when they didn't know if they were any good. So this changes that. Okay. The other thing too is concessions must be allowed to be used for any permissible expense. This could be used to buy down the rate. It could be used to offset really expensive fire insurance. You know, there are a lot of different things that concessions could be used towards for the buyer's closing costs. So there's your explanation. Then we get into the biggie, and you have to pay attention on this one because this is important. Seller does not authorize broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. That is the default. Okay. If your seller wants you to check that box saying, yes, we will entertain offers with concessions, and your MLS has that, you do need to check the box. Okay, because the default is you have no authorization. So if you do want to include that, then you have to check the box. Okay, I recently asked C.A.R. Legal, I actually asked Neil Kalin to explain why they went with the default that it would be that we don't authorize the broker to talk about concessions. And his explanation was that it's important that in our forms, we take you out of that conversation. If the seller wants to negotiate with the buyer as to concessions, it can be done in the purchase agreement, that we don't necessarily want the brokers involved behind the scenes. Okay, so that's why it's the default. Now, is it against the law to do that? No, it's perfectly fine to do that as far as the law is concerned. This course of action was taken because there are people that are looking at the practice of cooperating compensation and communicating certain things through the MLS as anti-competitive. So the best risk mitigation is to just remove it, right? So if your broker wants you to engage in this, please talk to your broker about that, because brokers are going to have different policies on what they do believe is the right thing to do. But the form defaults to the seller will not authorize the broker to include anything about concessions. All right. Then we get into listing agreements. Sometimes they want to change the price. Sometimes they need to change the expiration date. Maybe they want to change the compensation. Okay, maybe they now want you to check the box saying that I'll entertain offers with concessions. Any of those things, we normally did the modification of terms. Okay, now there will be a new form that's the modification of terms dash listing agreement. So that will include the terms that are most common from the listing agreement. Okay, there is another one of these for the buyer representation agreement. All right, buyer side forms. So this is where we get into the meat of it. And we definitely saw a lot of changes, not to the language per se, but to the grid format. Okay, so we're going to go through disclosure and modification to the buyer representation agreement. This is the same thing that we just went over on the listing side, that when the new rules go into effect, okay, we need to modify some of the terms of our previous agreement. Our buyer rep agreement right now says that if there's any overage, okay, if I sign a buyer rep agreement for 1 bottle of wine, and then the seller offers me 3 bottles of wine, I can take all 3 bottles. Under the terms of the settlement agreement, okay, and the new rules, then if I sign a buyer rep agreement for 1 bottle of wine, and somehow I get offered 3 bottles of wine, okay, I can only take the 1 bottle of wine. And that's what this explains. Under the new terms, then there are going to be certain things there. It also explains to buyers that we can no longer tell you what any offer of compensation is once it's removed from the MLS. So key on this one is if you have a buyer rep agreement that you've signed prior to the 24th of July, and then it's still in effect after the new rules go into effect, you will need to modify that, because you do have to make sure you change those terms. All right, so the buyer rep agreement, once again, we went into a grid format, but you're going to see that this looks just like our listing agreement starts off now, and just like our purchase agreement, date prepared, who are the parties, and guess what? You need to read all the pages. Even though the grid only covers 2 pages, Mr. Buyer, you should read the whole thing. Okay, it is 5 pages, mostly because of white space, to make sure that it is easier to read. All right, so we jump into our contract here. We go into representation period. It begins on this date, and it ends at 11:59 p.m. on this date. Okay, now, not to exceed 3 months, not 90 days, 3 months. And the reason for this is because I mentioned that there was going to be a new law going into effect. We anticipate on January 1st in the state of California, it will be required that before I can show a property, I must have a buyer representation agreement in place. Okay, that law is expected to include a caveat that that agreement cannot exceed 3 months. That's why it's 3 months and not 90 days, because that's what the legislation will say. So C.A.R, Standard Forms Advisory Committee, said, why don't we just put it in now, since it's going to be what the requirement is probably on January 1st. So not to exceed 3 months for a natural person, and it cannot be auto renewed. That will be part of the legislation. Okay. Type of representation, this is important. It defaults to non-exclusive, okay? If you want it to be exclusive, you have to check the box, and then you're gonna have to initial another paragraph, okay, in paragraph 15. The reason for that is we want the buyer to truly understand we're married. If we're making this exclusive, they need to understand that anything they write an offer on during this period, I get paid on if it's exclusive, okay? So that's why the default is non-exclusive. All right, then we go into what type of property is it? We're going to default to single family residential. You don't have to check a box if that's what you're doing. So you're doing a condo, you're doing a house, you're doing a manufactured home, you don't have to check a box. Then if you say, all right, well, they want a duplex. All right, we're going to check multifamily residential. Maybe they want vacant land, whatever, okay? Or you could put in specific properties if that's what you want to write it for. So that would be your default. The other thing too that you're going to see at the top in paragraph B, it says broker provides services for properties indicated and in location specified. The reason for that is they don't want us out there in the field writing in buyer representation agreements saying for any property purchased in the state of California, okay? I told you I'm in Southern California. I'm not working in San Francisco. Why would I sign an agreement with a buyer specifying an area that I don't work in? Okay, so that's why that is there. So you will need to fill something in your location. Okay, you have to fill in counties or cities. It really depends on your area. So like for one of our counties, San Diego County, it's about 60 miles top to bottom, tons of cities. So I wouldn't list every city possible because that would take me forever. But I could check the box that says San Diego County. Okay, and then write in San Diego County. So that way I do have it specified, but you do need to write something in. And then if you wanted to be more to define this property anymore, you certainly could in the additional description. But one of the things that I'll remind you is don't make it so specific that when the buyer changes their mind, you're going to have to amend your agreement, because we all know buyers do change their mind on this stuff, right? Now, if your buyer wants to get all specific, well, I definitely want a downstairs bedroom and I need a pool in the back and I need all of that stuff. One of the best things to do is to include that is the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. This is a nice long checklist of tell me your dreams, buyer, right? That isn't a part of the contract. That way you don't have to keep amending your contract every time they change one of their preferences, okay? You can truly just stick it on that form. It's also a really good form for helping to articulate your value as a buyer's agent. We have a lot of agents out there that are concerned about not being able to truly articulate their value as a buyer's agent, and these forms can help walk you through that process, okay? Now, the next thing, properties excluded from representation. Things that I might include there. Let's say I just met this buyer, we're entering into an agreement. I'm going to ask them, have you been working with another agent? Okay. Yes, I was working with another agent. Did you sign any agreements with them? No, I didn't. Okay, because that was before they were required, right? Okay, did you see any properties with them? If they did see any properties, I want to exclude those because otherwise my buyer could owe two compensations, right? So this is a spot for us to make sure that we're having this conversation. One of the most common questions I get asked is, what if a buyer has 3 different rep agreements for one property with 3 different brokers? Well, the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is if we are very, very clear in explaining the terms. When you sign this with me, Mr. Buyer, you are obligating yourself. So I want to make sure if you're obligated for anything else that we exclude them from this agreement. This is for your protection. Then they're going to tell you, right? Hopefully. All right. And then the other thing too that you could do is, let's say I'm taking them out for residential property, but they're also looking for commercial property with another broker. I might write in that commercial is excluded because I'm not going to advise on that. That is for their other broker to advise on. All right. Then we get into the tough stuff, right? here's our compensation conversation. And this must be a defined term. That is one of the terms of the settlement agreement. You can't write to be determined. You cannot write depends on what the seller's willing to pay. None of that stuff. You are sitting down. We wouldn't do that in a listing agreement. So I encourage you to think of this just like a listing agreement, right? I sit down with my seller. I say, this is what I do. This is what I charge. We negotiate. We come up with a number. We're going to do the same thing with a buyer. This is what I do. This is what I charge. We're going to come up with a number. We're going to write it in. Now my buyer freaks out and says, oh, but Nikki, I don't have that money. That's okay, because look at the next paragraph. Payments received by broker from seller or others will offset your obligation. Okay, so they have this obligation of a number. And then I say, if you don't have the cash for that, that's fine. We can include it as a term in the agreement, okay? And ask the seller to pay that obligation. Historically, in the state of California, remember that broker compensation advisory, that last paragraph that says, historically, sellers have paid buyer agent compensation. That wasn't because sellers just had oodles of money and figured they should pay it. It's because buyers often don't have the extra funds for that, especially at our price points. So do we expect the buyers to suddenly have this money? No, not necessarily. We expect that there will be a lot of buyers that say, seller, will you pay that obligation? So they're not going to be the only one putting that offer out there. All right, then we go to continued right for payment of broker-involved properties. What is this? That is our safety clause. Just like we just went over in the listing agreement, if after cancellation or expiration, you end up buying something that I was involved with showing you, then I would get compensated, okay? Continuation period, that should not be longer than what the agreement is written for. If I write this agreement for 3 months, continuation period shouldn't be more than 3 months, okay? So that is the advice that we're hearing right now. All right. Then we go into cancellation right and notice. So if it's non-exclusive agreement, which is our default, then cancellation can be by either the buyer or by the agent, and it's effective upon receipt of written request for cancellation. Okay, so right away, that's for your non-exclusives. Now, that's why it's important to have that nice little thing that we talked about here, continued right for payment, that continuation period. If the buyer says, Nikki, I want to cancel with you. Okay, that is effective upon receipt, but I'm going to send them the form that they're going to use to cancel. And on that, I am going to list all of the properties that I showed them that I had broker involvement on. Okay, so that's an important dynamic too, and I will show you that form, but just remember that when we get there. If it's an exclusive agreement, then cancellation is effective 30 days after the receipt of the written cancellation notice. Okay, that's built in to protect you. So let's say I have an exclusive agreement. My buyer goes out to an open house and somehow the listing agent says, no, cancel your agreement with your person. And then I'll write your offer and I'll make sure it gets accepted. Okay. Regardless of how we feel about that, if that happens and it was an exclusive agreement, then understand they're still under contract. It's not effective for 30 days. That's kind of why that was written in there, to just make sure that everybody is acting in good faith. Okay, buyer personal financial information. One of the big concerns when we started writing this, putting this contract together was, how do we ask the buyer if they really do have the funds to pay me? And so it says within 5 calendar days from the execution of the agreement, buyer is going to show us the funds. And when we get into the definitions of this, okay, this is further defined in paragraph 9B. You can see that in the grid. Okay. Then it says you need to show that you have proof of, proof of your deposit, proof of your down payment, proof of your closing costs. And if you say you can pay me, proof that you can pay me. Okay. So we need to see all those funds. Okay. Now we can also put C.A.R form BFPI. buyer financial and personal information. Okay, this is another form that can build up that value to show them that, hey, you know, here is the benefit of my experience that can make this easier for you. Okay, so maybe before I even met with the buyer, I sent them these forms. Okay, so if I did, then the buyer financial and personal information is attached. I could check the box. Okay. All right. Now, this is where we also get to. So this buyer is all in, but they're like, I'm really worried about signing this, Nikki, because again, I don't have the funds to pay you. I think you're lovely, but I do not have any money. All right, great. This is where we're going to check this box. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Okay. Now, this doesn't have to be ugly because they're also going to be writing an offer for $1 million. Do they have $1 million? No. It's contingent on getting a loan for $1 million. This is very similar. Okay. They don't have the funds to pay me. So this will create a contingency that the seller is willing to pay their obligation. Okay. So I'm going to check that box and you're going to see that in the language later on as we get into paragraph 9B. Okay. And then of course, other terms. All right. So again, we're not going to go over every paragraph of the BRBC because otherwise I'm not going to get through this slideshow. What we are going to go over is what changed. So there was already a lot of language in our buyer rep agreement. So I'm going to show you where the changes are and then just some of the reformatting. Once again, we're going to let people know that commissions are not fixed by law. They are negotiable. We're going to say that a million times. Okay. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer enters into an agreement during the representation period and buyer defaults as well, just like in our listing agreement, right? So those same protections, it's very similar. We're just talking about a different type of client. Instead of a seller, we're talking about a buyer, okay? This is where we go into what, non-exclusive compensation is payable only if there was broker involvement. Okay, so again, our whole agreement defaults to non-exclusive representation. So if that's what I have, okay, and I go out and show Bob 3 properties on Saturday, and then on Sunday he goes out and sees a 4th property, I am not entitled to payment because I wasn't there. I wasn't involved. There was no broker involvement, but I am entitled for the 3 that I showed him. Kind of makes sense that I would get paid for what I work for, right? If somebody else shows them that 4th one and they were the one that had the broker involvement, they're the one that gets paid. That's on your non-exclusive. Exclusive, if it's checked and it's initialed, broker is entitled to compensation if the buyer acquires the property during the entire representation period or any extension, with or without broker involvement. So on an exclusive, if I showed you 3 properties on Saturday, you went and saw a 4th property on your own on Sunday and bought it, I am still entitled to compensation because we had an exclusive agreement. Okay. The other thing too is it does define. So if I sit down and I sign something with Joe, and then Joe says, well, wait a minute, I want to buy this. And his wife, Martha, she writes the offer. Okay. Buyer includes anybody that is acting on that buyer's behalf. Okay. Broker involvement. So we just talked about compensation is payable only if there's broker involvement. Well, what is broker involvement? This is where it's defined. Bullet points make it very, very easy. Basically, for those of us that are operating in the field right now, if I just set you up on a search and it sent you the property, I'm not involved. Okay. That is not considered broker involvement. But if you called me, you asked me for the history, we talked about the school district, I did some comps for you, broker involvement, okay? I go out and show it to you, broker involvement. I do a virtual showing, that's broker involvement. So if you're involved, you want to make sure you document this because if a question comes up, you want to make sure that you're entitled to compensation. Okay. All right. Then it also says that I'm entitled to compensation during the safety clause period for the properties that I sent you. Okay. If this agreement that I have with you expires, then before expiration, I have to give you a list of all the properties that I've shown you, okay, that I had broker involvement in. And if I don't, then I don't have the right to that compensation. So that creates, you're going to create this list on the NBIP, notice of broker involved properties. And again, new form, I'll show it to you. And again, before expiration, or if my buyer wants to cancel on me within 5 days of cancellation. Okay, so that's an important note of that. The big thing that I think of from practice is that you want to make sure you're keeping track of what you're showing your buyer, because if they want to cancel on you, they don't necessarily give you a lot of notice. So you want to make sure that you have your list ready. So make sure you're writing that down. This is where the whole idea of highlighting this paragraph is for that a buyer that's really scared. They're like, Nikki, I don't have the money. I don't know how to be more clear. You say, no, don't worry about it. This is where it says that compensation is due when we close, okay? Just like everything else. So it'll be taken out of your closing costs. I also get the question, do they bring a check to me? No, all of this is done through escrow. So that is when it's due, okay? And that's where this goes over. Buyer agrees to deliver funds to escrow. Remember when your buyer is in escrow and escrow sends out a estimated closing statement and it has those magic words, cash to close, and it has a number there? That includes all their closing costs, all their loan fees, all of their everything, right? And their deposit and any of their down payment amount. That number will also include your compensation if your buyer's paying you, okay? All right. Let's see. So this also goes through with your buyer that if you are asking the seller to pay the buyer's compensation obligation in your offer, it may make your offer less attractive to the seller. Okay. This is a reality. Anytime you're asking for a credit from the seller, it may make your offer less attractive. But this is also where we show our value, guys. Okay. Our purchase agreement has 3 pages of terms for the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Compensation, price, those are only 2 of the terms. There are a lot of different ways that you can sweeten the deal. For me, I flash back to doing VA no-nos. I've done a lot of VA no-nos. That means they don't even have a deposit. They do not have funds for their closing costs and they have no down payment. That's a VA no-no, okay? I've worked with those buyers, and that means that I have to sit with them and say, you do understand that we do have to find a seller that's willing to credit those. And you're going to have to sweeten the deal on the rest of those terms to make it so that it's attractive to the seller. This is no different. Anytime you're asking for something, you most likely need to give something, okay? So use your negotiation skills to make that offer more attractive to that seller, okay? All right. Properties excluded. All right, so this is where we say, all right, now we're getting ready to sign. We're almost to the signature pages, buyer. Just to confirm, you have not signed any other agreements, correct? If you have, I need to see them. I need to see if you already signed an exclusive. If you already signed an exclusive, all this is moot. I can't sign an agreement with you, and I don't, and said with love, I don't want to waste my time. So this is where you go back and say, are you sure? Because if we sign this agreement, then I go show you a property that you're already obligated under another agreement to pay another broker. You're going to owe 2 commissions, not just the 1. So this is our reminder to walk them through this. And this is where it says, no, I, as the buyer, I swear I've not signed anything else. Okay. Then this also says, so if I'm your buyer's agent, okay, and we've decided that I'm going to do all your residential work, okay, then when you're doing your commercial work with your commercial broker and you call me and say, Nikki, I need your advice on this transaction, it says I don't have to assist with this if it has been excluded. Remember, I excluded commercial. It's not something that I'm involved in. Ask your other broker. All right. So this is not any news to any of us. We've always known what the work that we do out in the field, but this is what the broker agrees to perform the tasks indicated here in this nice little checklist. So I highlight this because if you're concerned about not being able to articulate your value proposition, okay, this may help take you through your last transaction and just kind of go, okay, these are the things that I do. This is how I'm able to tell the buyer, this is what I do, and this is what I work for. All right, buyer obligations. You have to operate in good faith and you have to provide the financials within 5 days. Okay, that means you have to ask for it, guys. If you don't ask for it, then they're not going to know to give it to you. Okay, then this is where we've checked the box. We checked the box that said broker does not, or buyer does not have the funds to pay broker, right? Okay, this says if buyer does not have the funds to pay compensation, buyer agrees to include a term in the purchase agreement requesting the seller to pay that obligation. Okay, so this kind of gives you the ability to write it in, the permission, all of that stuff, because we're the ones that, kind of draft up the RPA, right? For the transaction, this is contingent on the seller agreeing. So when we look at this buyer that's very worried that somehow I am going to try and squeeze funds out of him that he does not have, okay, you can tell them this is contingent. And for some reason, this seller doesn't agree, okay, and the buyer wants to proceed without representation, I, as the broker, can cancel out of this because if I'm not being compensated, then I'm not going to take on that liability. All right, reasonable care. I love this part and I highlight it just because it usually makes people laugh when we're in person. Buyer agrees to read all documents that I present to them. I know, right? Wouldn't it be great if they did? But also to seek professional advice. Don't ask me to crawl up in the attic and determine if the insulation is good. So this kind of sets the tone for some of the things that I really do as a buyer's agent and are my responsibility. Okay. And they agree to seek the professionals when needed. All right, this also talks about a new form. I know, another new one that was created, the BMISP. Okay, this is buyer material issues for a specific property. So it makes reference to that. I will go over the form. All right, then we go into, remember we talked about it, it's non-exclusive unless you check the box in the grid. And then the buyer also initials this nice, beautiful paragraph. Okay, if they don't initial, it's not exclusive. Reason why is we didn't want some unscrupulous agent sending out 700 exclusive agreements to every person they've ever met in their life and binding them. They were concerned that buyers wouldn't be used to reading all of these and wanted to make sure that if the buyer agrees to an exclusive agreement, an exclusive representation agreement, that the buyer understands what that means. So once again, this is exclusive. We're married, no cheating on me. They initial there, right? All right. Then we move on to, this is the confirmation of compensation paragraph. Now, this is set up to autofill. So whatever I put in the grid is my compensation, okay, should autofill to this particular field. Wonders of technology, who knows if it'll work, but it should autofill, okay? If it doesn't, you're gonna write in the same number that you did previously. Why? Well, because there is a form that says when we use the SPBB, there is a place where the seller can say, prove to me, Mr. Buyer, that you agreed to pay your agent this much. So instead of me as the buyer's agent sending the entire very personal agreement with my buyer over to the listing agent, I can send just this one page. It's page 5 of the agreement that shows the confirmation of compensation. And I'll refer back to this when we talk about that particular form. All right, so remember, in the grid, it talked about the buyer financial and personal information form, the BFPI, okay? This is what the form looks like. So if the buyer says, well, I don't know where I'm going to come up with the money for certain things, these are the different things that we're going to talk about. Some agents have said they're going to send these out beforehand to get a good idea get the buyer thinking down the right roads. All right, where's your money coming from? How long is it going to take? You know, what kind of things have you been involved in before? So lots of different questions. If you're an experienced agent, you probably do this in your sleep at this point because you already have your narrative for it. But there's a form for it if you're not used to doing it. And if I'm sitting with a buyer and I'm going through a whole presentation, kind of looks good if I've got some additional things to ask them, right? So there's that. And then current housing. Do you rent? Do you own? Those are always good things to find out. If you're renting, you're probably not paying a water bill, probably not paying a trash bill. So understanding that and making sure that you're setting proper expectations for when they own the home is important. Last but not least, on this particular buyer financial and personal information form is confidentiality. So if the listing agent says, I want to see your BFPI, Mr. Buyer's agent, okay, you can say no. This is between me and my buyer. We have a confidentiality agreement. This is not to be shared outside of the buyer and buyer agent relationship. All right. So there's also in the grid a reference for, we already decided our property type, right? Now we wanted to add additional details. My buyer wants all of those things, downstairs office, the pool, all of that. So I checked the box and CAR form BIPP, the BIP will populate. That's buyer identification of preferences and priorities. Think of this more as the wish list. This is when we first get started. Buyer, it's very important. This paragraph says it's super important that you tell me, the agent, what you really want so that I can make sure that I'm putting the right properties in front of you. Okay, so it goes through all those general questions. If you've been doing this for a while, you probably already have done this in your sleep as well. But again, there's a form for it. Then it also says confidentiality. I'm not going to tell anybody that the pool is a deal breaker. This is between us. I'm not sending it to the listing agent. Okay, so very cool little form on that. All right, then there's also that spot I told you, a new form for the BMISP, buyer material issues for specific properties. And what this states is that I went through with you, Mr. Buyer. We filled out the dream list, right? Buyer identification of preferences and priorities. You told me all the wonderful things that you want. Well, now we've found your dream home and we just entered into escrow. So what I'm going to say is for this specific property buyer, I need to know what your concerns are. What issues are material to you? Okay, this is where they say, I have to be in the Poway School District. I can't be within 3 miles of a cell phone tower. You know, all those oddities that they've told you as you've been walking through properties, we now want to document them. Okay, one of the reasons for this is when you use this form, it's very helpful if that buyer files a claim against you later on saying you never told them anything. Okay, this will be helpful in your defense. So I do understand it's yet another form, but it's a good way to go, okay, now that we've found this rural property and it was never on your wish list and there's a gully down the middle, is that a concern to you? Okay, doesn't mean that you have to have all the answers, but it does mean that they're going to say, find out if the gully is an easement, find out if there's been whatever. You can go and reference things in the title report, send them to the title officer. So this is the form that you would use, buyer material issues for a specific property. All right, cancellation of the buyer representation agreement. Hopefully you don't have to do this, but this is the form that was created. If your buyer says, let's say I have a non-exclusive agreement, buyer says, Nikki, it's just not working out. Okay, I want to cancel. All right, great. I'm going to pull out this form. Now, there are a lot of moving parts. So just kind of stay focused, and then you're going to need to reread this when it actually comes up. Sit down with your broker, have them walk you through it. Okay. Like I said, lots of moving parts. Notice of cancellation of buyer representation. Okay, so buyer could cancel, broker could cancel, both could cancel, could be mutual, right? Effective date of cancellation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, notice applies to the subject property, to the buyer representation, or for the following properties. All of these things, okay, it goes through and says. Now, what this defaults to is that I will be entitled to compensation as provided for, that we already covered in the buyer representation agreement. Okay, so that says as long as I give you the list of broker involved properties and you end up buying them, then I would get compensation, right? So that is what the default is. But then you could also check some other boxes. Okay, so here's our default: buyer agrees to pay broker as specified in the written agreement between them, BRBC, or the dating form, which we'll go over, the PSRA. Okay. Or you can check this box: compensation shall be paid as specified in paragraph 3. Okay, so here's our default: it's paid per the agreement. Or you could come up with other terms. This can be unilateral, okay, buyer or broker cancellation. And remember, every time it says broker, this is the agent acting on the broker behalf. Okay, you can sign this stuff. All right. Then we get into 3. Here's all of our different things. Maybe I will let you cancel this exclusive agreement, but I want you to, buyer agrees to pay broker X amount of money for out-of-pocket expenses. Now, to be fair, I don't know if we're coming up with gas receipts, what we're putting into this, but it's an option. Maybe I say, I'll let you go because honestly, this isn't working out. You're not my kind of buyer, but I do want a referral fee. So I'll release them from the contract, but I want a referral fee. Okay, so maybe I check that box. Or I just say, wow, this has been a nightmare. You want to quit, I want to quit. No compensation whatsoever, no broker involved properties. I am running for the hills. Okay, I have the option of doing that too. But remember, this is where we talked about, okay, maybe I'm going to say, fine, I'll let you go ahead and cancel. Here are all the broker involved properties. This is where I'm going to give them the notice. Okay. So I can do it in that cancellation. If the buyer wanted to cancel on me, I'm going to list them. Okay. And then in the notice and broker involved properties, let's say we didn't go to cancellation. My buyer rep agreement is just set to expire tomorrow. Then I'm going to give them the notice of broker involved properties. It's going to be the list of all the things I was involved in before expiration, and that's key, okay, on this form. All right, so it goes through all of this stuff that we already know. Broker involved properties, I'm going to list them all, okay? Then it also says notifying new broker. You need to let your new broker, if you're dumping me for someone else, you need to let them know that you're already committed to me on these properties. So you should give this form to them. Then date of notice. This is incredibly important because remember, this only works if I deliver this list prior to expiration of my agreement or within 5 days if canceled. Okay, so I need to make sure that the date is in there. And then we get the question of, well, what if the buyer just refuses to sign it? That's fine. It says, note to buyer. Once this notice of broker involved properties has been delivered to you, it is effective, even if you don't sign. Okay, so takes care of that. All right, modification of terms. We already talked about this, that we had a modification of terms that was specific to our listing agreement, right? And the most common terms that we would modify in a listing agreement. Well, we have the same thing now, a modification of terms for our buyer representation agreement. Okay, there's some default items in there: expiration date, compensation, and then there is the ever popular other. You can write in whatever you need to, especially if maybe you got too specific in your original agreement. You wrote in 4-bedroom home and now they're okay with a 3-bedroom home. Okay, well, you probably want to modify that. If you got too specific and you need to make it a little more general, then you could do that in this form. All right, we are in the home stretch, guys. Additional forms. So we're going to go over the open house forms, then the purchase agreement stuff, and then we are going to touch lightly on the new leasing stuff. All right, so open house, visitor, non-agency disclosure, and sign-in form. Again, our MLS rules and the rules of the settlement agreement say that as an agent, before I show a property, I must have a buyer representation agreement in place. Okay, so if I'm at an open house, I have this listing, I'm at the open house, a visitor walks in and they want me to show them the property. What do I do? Do I have to have an agreement? Well, yeah, that's kind of cloudy. So we're going with yes, we either need to have an agreement or we need to sign this. So this is going to be your default: open house visitor, non-agency disclosure, and sign in. So I'm going to fill this out and print about 5 copies of this. Okay. This says the property address and then who I am, who I work for, right? Then I go through and say, Mr. Visitor, I am showing you this property based on the following criteria. And one of the reasons why this is so important in California is because the DRE, our Department of Real Estate, believes that it's incredibly important that if a visitor comes into the open house and I give them information, that visitor needs to know that all the information I'm giving them is for the benefit of the seller, not for their benefit. If you want my advice, you want my guidance, you must sign a buyer representation agreement with me. Otherwise, everything I do is on behalf of the seller. So that's what this says. Okay, look, I don't represent you. Anything and everything I tell you is for the benefit of the seller. You're going to tell me your great big secrets? Guess what? I'm going to turn around and tell the seller because it's not confidential. Okay. If you decide that you want me to represent you in the purchase and give you advice, we're going to need to sign a different agreement, either the PSRA, or the buyer representation agreement that we've already gone over. These are the terms in which I will show you the home. So this suffices. You can have them sign there. If they say they already have an agreement with someone else, that's great, because remember, this is, I don't represent you. Okay. They can write in their agent name. You can follow up with the agent later on. If they write Mickey Mouse, do you need to tackle them? No, not necessarily. Remember, you're going through the functions of your job. And this is our part of the terms of us being covered under the settlement agreement. Okay. We don't know if people will go out and shop open houses to make sure that we're all being compliant or not. So I would say this is going to be the default, that you just do this. Then they come back, they saw the house, and they say, well, Nikki, I love the house and I would love for you to represent me. I say, okay, great. I've got a couple of these little bad boys with me. It's the property showing and representation agreement. Okay. I go ahead and put this in. I refer to this one as the dating form. The buyer rep agreement, we're kind of getting married, right? We went through a lot of terms. We have our prenup. We have the terms of our agreement. This is only going to apply for up to 3 properties. Okay. So you want me, prospective buyer, the broker, and I'm writing in the property address. And maybe they say, I want you to represent me if I write the offer on this property or the one across the street that's just like it. So I can pop that address in there too. So I can do up to 3 properties on this particular form. Okay. Then I go in, same things that we've seen before. Okay. This is non-exclusive. That is the agreement. It's three pages. Okay. Then we go to the grid. This is the whole grid, guys. Okay. So nice and easy. Like I said, dating form, representation period cannot exceed 30 days. All we're doing is figuring out if we like each other. Okay. Showing these 3 specific properties. That's it. So cannot exceed 30 days, can be less, right? Okay. Then we go into compensation, because again, I have to have a buyer representation agreement. I must have compensation defined. This is what I do. This is what I'm worth. We put that in. He says, well, wait a minute. I don't have the funds, Nikki. No problem. We look at the next paragraph. We'll ask the seller to pay. We'll include that in your offer, asking the seller to pay that obligation. All right. Cancellation rights and notice. Okay. Effective upon receipt or days after receipt, you could write in. Okay. So that's all of our grid for that whole thing. Then all the rest of this is very similar to the BRBC. What the compensation is, it's negotiable, it's the fees, here's what broker involvement is, timing of compensation. All of this is the same as what we already went through in the BRBC, but just a truncated version of most of it. Okay. So again, this is the dating form. This also works really, really well for sign calls. So, you get the sign call, no, I don't have a buyer's agent. Will you show me your listing on 123 Main Street? Well, technically I can't show you at a property without a representation agreement, right? So I could use this and say, yes, I can show it to you, but I need to send you an agreement first. How great is that? Instead of just having to run out there, and you can have the conversation about their representation. So that is the dating form. That's the property showing and representation agreement. Okay. All of this is the same kind of stuff that was in our BRBC. Then we get to the very end. Prospective buyers attending an open house without representation. So you are the buyer, you walked through, you said, I love it. Nikki, if I write an offer, I want you to represent me. Okay, great. Just so you know, before we move forward, you're not required to sign this. Okay, you're signing this because you want to sign this. You already saw the property, you could have signed the other form. It's important for me to let them know that. Then, Mr. Buyer, you want my advice. I need to know, have you already signed a representation agreement with someone else? Because if you have, you could be responsible for paying them and for paying me. Okay, so that's an important dynamic there too. So this is right before the signature line on this particular agreement. All right, now we're going to jump into the RPA key paragraphs and the changes that we'll see on the 24th. So the big change here, it's kind of interesting because you only see red on the number 3 and the number 4. That's because a term was pulled out of here. It used to say that per the MLS or cooperating broker compensation agreement, then that's how compensation will be paid to the buyer's agent. Well, we had to pull that out, right? Because we have no more references to cooperating compensation between the brokers. So that was pulled out. The form CBC that you guys can see right now in the library, that's cooperating broker compensation. That form will be deleted from the library. All right, so the key paragraphs to where we're going to ask for this. So I have my buyer representation agreement already signed with my buyer. My buyer said, Nikki, I don't have the funds. I said, no problem. We can include a term in the purchase agreement asking the seller to pay your obligation. Okay. Now I can do it in 2 different places. I can do it just as a credit. So let's say that the buyer's obligation is 10 bottles of wine. Okay. And the buyer says, well, I have 5 bottles of wine, but I would like the seller to give you 5 bottles of wine. I say, okay, seller credit, if any, I can go ahead and write in 5 bottles of wine. And you're not writing bottles of wine. You all know what I'm doing here. But anyway, I can write in the other part, and that would just be like a credit to their closing costs. Because remember, on the buyer's closing statement, it's going to be 10 bottles of wine. The buyer will bring in 5, and then the seller will credit the other 5. So that's how a concession could work. So you can write in a number like that, or you can check 3G3. 3G3, you check the box. It says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. And that is C.A.R. form SPBB, which stands for seller payment to buyer's broker. Okay. So if you do that, then this is the form that will populate into your transaction. Okay. This is what we actually expect to be the norm. And because it explains things a little bit better. That whole concessions thing seems to be confusing to the public. So this being said, this is the first part of it. You know all those answers. Then it goes in and it says, okay, seller payment amount subject to seller agrees to pay buyer's broker blank % of the purchase price or whatever. Okay. Now remember, this cannot be more than what you wrote your BRBC for. So whatever your buyer representation agreement says, that's the number that goes in here. Okay. It cannot be more than that. And then it goes on to say maximum seller obligation. Let's say that seller agrees to everything. And then the seller finds out that I didn't have a buyer representation agreement, or that the buyer representation agreement was written for less than what's here. The seller is only obligated for the least amount, or if there was no rep agreement, seller's not obligated to pay anything. You get nothing. So remember, write your representation agreements. Okay. Now, this form will also say that, guess what? As the seller, it's not that I don't believe you, buyer, but I do want proof that you actually have a buyer representation agreement and that it is for this amount. So that's where the last page of the buyer representation agreement, that has the confirmation of compensation. You can send that over to the listing side to show the seller so that the seller can get that confirmation. Okay, so page 5 suffices for all of that. All right, so that is the end of those. We're going to go really quickly into the tenant representation, and then we will go into the chat and we will answer questions. Okay, so tenant representation and broker compensation agreement. When we talk about the settlement agreement, all of the terms were really surrounding residential 1 to 4 unit properties for purchase. Okay, but if we have tenants, we have listings for rentals in our MLS. And when our MLS removes the cooperating compensation field, okay, well, now how do we talk about that? Even though we technically under the rules, we didn't have to do it for tenants, we now don't have that field. So let's take the same concepts of representing a buyer and put it together in a tenant representation and broker compensation agreement. All right, Mr. Tenant, I'm going to represent you. Here's our grid. Okay. So we're going through what kind of property do you want? What's the location? Da, 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 da. Now let's go additional preferences. Are you doing a month to month? Are you doing a fixed term? Now let's talk about the fixed term or about the amount of compensation. And again, we can offset that if the housing provider is going to pay some compensation towards your obligation, it offsets what you owe me, and then other terms. Okay. All of this stuff, same stuff that we've seen in our other representation agreements. Okay. Compensation to broker, all of that good stuff. Now we look at it. I'm representing a housing provider, okay, so an owner of a property, and they want me to list their lease in the MLS. So I'm using the lease listing agreement. What we have in there right now is we say, what kind of cooperation would you like me to offer to the other side? Well, again, that's gone. So this form has been changed to where it says compensation to broker, okay, that RPO agrees to pay broker as compensation for services, does not include compensation for irrespective of agency as specified below. Okay. And this is for their agent only. So it takes out the paragraphs of when we said we're going to offer cooperating compensation. So that's the lease listing agreement. Once again, that releases on the 24th. And that is all of the changes. All right, let's go ahead and start off with Doreen. Can you give me a question from and I'm sorry, let me introduce these lovely ladies that have very nicely volunteered to help me with the Q&A because I can't read things and answer them at the same time. So Doreen Smith and Holly Mitchell are going to be coordinating reading the questions out of the Q&A to me. All right, let's start with Doreen. What do you have?
Is the open house form needed by all attendees? Do we have those printed and ready for visitors?
The guidance by C.A.R. Legal at this point is that you should have the open house non-agency sign-in. So that's the OHNA-SI. Okay, you should have that at every open house. And theoretically, the conversation goes, "Hi, Mr. Visitor, how are you today?" They say, "I'm lovely." You say, "Great, I'm going to need you to sign in." And they go, "Okay." You say, "Are you working with an agent right now?" "I am." "Okay, great." They're going to sign in on that form, right? That sets the tone right at the very beginning that I don't work for you. Okay, I'm showing the house. The whole intent is I'm showing the house on behalf of the seller, right? So I can't give you advice. So yes, that would be what the default is. They say, "No, I actually came over here because I think you're an amazing person and I would like to hire you as my realtor." Okay, fabulous. That's why I'm also bringing a couple representation agreements with me, or I'm learning how to access them on my tablet. If you don't have that ability, that's something that's very, very helpful, something to look into. So yes, you're going to have to do one or the other. When they come in, they're either going to say, "I understand you do not represent me." That's the open house sign in. Okay. Or they're going to say, "Yes, we now have a relationship." Holly?
BRBCG2, if the buyer does technically have the funds, but they don't want to pay, can they use that checkbox? I don't have the funds.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, you can also look at it from the perspective of most buyers that are moving into a new property. They want to do some things, right? So they want to repaint, they want to, whatever. They want to do some things. So they may have the funds, but technically those funds are not, they don't want to use it for that. They want to use it for improvement to the property. You can certainly, I mean, what funds do we have? It's what's available to them. What we want to do is make sure that they understand that, okay, if you don't want to pay me, that's fine, but you're empowering
To me.
me to be able to write in a term in your contract.
So from now until August 13th, do we need to require our clients to sign the BRBC before working with them?
As soon as your MLS rules change, which will probably be before August 17th. Okay, so the absolute positive deadline is August 17th or when your MLS rules change. Okay, now all of that being said, you usually don't work with a buyer for one day, right? So if you are literally signing up a buyer, if you're going to start working with a buyer on August 3rd and in 14 days the rules are going to change, I'd say you might want to just lean in and go ahead and sign the buyer representation agreement. Okay, it's going to be something you need to do anyway when it comes to that, and you want to already set those terms up. Holly?
Can you review what form or forms for listing modification they will need to use for current listings in the MLS once the cooperating compensation goes away?
When the cooperating compensation goes away, if you have something that's active, not in pending status in the MLS, okay, that means it's truly being marketed. Then you're going to have to use the form DM-LA. That's disclosure and modification to the listing agreement. That will release on the 24th of this month.
What is the newest on a VA buyer right now? Are they still not allowed to pay? So only the homes where a seller will pay will work?
VA guidelines, okay, state that there is a prohibition on the buyer paying buyer side or buyer agent compensation. Okay, what the VA came out and stated after the settlement agreement was released was that they will not enforce the prohibition. Okay, so the rules technically have not been rewritten. We're hoping they will be. But at this point, the VA will not enforce the prohibition, so therefore buyers can do it.
And there's another one that's similar to that says, not just for a VA loan, but the seller doesn't want to pay the buyer broker fee. The fee can be financed into the buyer's loan.
Not really, okay? They won't do that and that's against the lending guidelines. But at the end of the day, guys, let's think about this. If the buyer didn't have closing costs, okay, and they needed, let's say 20 grand for closing costs, and they write the offer, can they quote unquote finance those closing costs? Well, they kind of can because they can write the offer 20 grand higher, right? And then the loan comes in, as long as we get the appraisal, they have financed those costs. So if we think about it over the years, because we had cooperating compensation behind the scenes, then they've always been financing that cost. But as an outright, I'm going to finance this cost, can I get a loan for it? No, it's not allowed. But you can do it in creativity, in writing and negotiating your offer.
If I have a current listing that shows compensation to the buyer's agent, how is that changed or dropped from the MLS once these changes go into effect?
When the MLS changes their rules, and I'll give you an example, C.A.R. MLS on the night of the 12th, okay, that's when they plan to remove the field altogether. So the field right now that says BAC, or if you're in Paragon, CBC, okay, that field that we all look at, it's gone. It no longer exists. So can they still see it behind the scenes? Yeah, they can, but none of us can. So you're going to do that DM-LA, disclosure and modification of listing agreement, to say to your seller, Before, we were offering X amount in the MLS. That field is now hidden. Therefore, we need to modify this because I can no longer do what I told you I was going to do. I told you in the listing agreement, I was going to put it in the MLS and offer cooperating compensation, but those days are gone. So that's why you use the form. It's already pre-printed.
If a broker oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, go Holly. Holly.
If a broker consistently has in his listings an offer of a seller concession of a certain percentage, then is there an issue that they're violating the settlement agreement?
That's a matter of opinion. And that's honestly, that whole concept is really why C.A.R. decided to write the forms that the way that they did. If you look at it, our MLSA, the new form that's the multiple listing service addendum, okay, it defaults to not doing anything about concessions. Then you can check a box saying seller authorizes broker to tell people they'll entertain them. Then there's further language that says, seller, if you want to throw an amount in there, you're going to have to provide your own language, because C.A.R. does not want to facilitate that. They don't want a lawsuit from the Department of Justice saying that we tried to skirt this and we all colluded to skirt the terms of the settlement agreement. So that's why it's there.
Where can we find these draft forms?
Go to CAR.org, okay? At the very top, there's a nice banner and it says new forms. Just click there. It's going to take you to all these resources. You'll be able to download the red lines of these forms. You'll be able to see the frequently asked questions, and you'll be able to see the links to access the free training on each of these forms. C.A.R. Legal, it's Neil Kalin and Jenna Gardner. They do the walkthrough on these. Very, very good. What I do is just kind of real life. This is when the seller would say that, blah, blah, blah. They're going to give you more of that legal background. So I highly recommend that you go ahead and attend those.
If a buyer checks the box, they can't pay my fee, and when we submit the offer, the seller says they won't pay, can the buyer move ahead by representing themselves?
Technically, yes. Okay. If they wanted to cancel it, then they can do that. And then you would have to cancel your agency. It is something that can happen, and it is a risk that we all take whenever we're working with somebody that is basically contingent, right? So it's something that you want to evaluate in your practice. But what I'll say is this, and this is what I said to all of my agents. Come on, guys, we've got 3 pages worth of negotiable terms in that purchase agreement. How do sellers operate? Do sellers sit there and want to counter each and every fee? Usually, sellers say, I want to net X amount. They don't honestly care how they get there. So if the seller is really countering one different item, you could probably pick up those costs on other things. Maybe you're taking up escrow, or you're giving up the seller paying for your home warranty. Maybe you're increasing the price. Maybe you're offering to let them remain in possession for 2 weeks for free. Again, this is our skill set, guys. This is how we negotiate. So if that came back that the seller specifically countered out that item, then you're going to say, all right, how can we, here's the deal. My buyer can't buy if you don't pay that. So we want the house. How can we make this work? You're going to figure out a way to find something that everybody can come to terms on. Just like our request for repairs, all the different negotiations we do through an entire transaction.
If an agent is with their client at an open house, do they need to sign the OHNA-SI?
Nope, because you're not showing the property. Their agent's showing the property. Remember, it comes into you're showing the property, then that's where the settlement agreement says if I show it, then I need a buyer rep agreement, or I need a form saying he doesn't want representation. So I need either or if I'm showing. If I'm not showing, then I don't need it.
If a buyer has seen another property by another broker and is interested in your representation, and the buyer didn't sign anything and was not asked to sign anything with the other broker, Must you exclude that property nonetheless?
Oh, wow. Without a written agreement, I mean, technically, no, they're not bound to the other agent. Procuring cause was a term that was really brought to our world because of the promise of cooperation in the MLS. So literally, if that happened right now, we still have a promise of cooperation in the MLS. But when that disappears and that promise is no longer there, then no, if they didn't bound them, they're not bound to that agent. So I would think that that broker would have a hard time trying to collect on that compensation.
Is where would we put in the MLS that the seller is willing to cooperate with concessions?
This is going to be MLS to MLS. So I can give you the example of what I know from C.A.R. MLS because they have been very vocal about what's in their system now. So at C.A.R. MLS, they have a field that says concessions in price. Okay. Then there are 3 different spots. First one is a checkbox. Is seller willing to entertain offers containing concessions? And you check yes or you check no. You don't get to write in any numbers. You don't get to give your commentary. Yes, no. Then you say, does seller want you to specify an amount? Okay. If they do, you either put in a percentage or a dollar amount. Okay. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to disappear now that C.A.R. has changed the way that they've written their forms. So that's what I know right now is in C.A.R. MLS. I don't know if that's what's going to remain. I'm not really sure. So we will see at your MLS. They should have already reached out to you about rule changes.
For an existing listing not yet sold nor receiving offers, would the seller still be required to pay the entire commission for both seller and buyer's agent?
Right now, if that's the contract they signed and it's in the MLS, yes. When that goes away and we do the practice changes, that's why you have to modify the agreement. As soon as cooperating compensation comes out of your MLS or by August 17th, you have to modify the agreement that will then lift the burden of that obligation off of that seller.
Can we still advertise the seller's willingness to pay a buyer broker compensation in other media, not on the MLS? If so, what is the best way to obtain seller's instructions to do so?
Under the terms of the agreement, yes, that is allowed. However, what I will say is you need to talk to your broker. When C.A.R. takes a specific position saying that they don't want to engage in talking about cooperating compensation because of all the media noise, because of all the concerns, and they find it to be a risk mitigation tool, then your broker may feel that same way. I know that in my brokerage, very specifically, my agents are instructed not to do that at all. Okay, because I don't want anyone coming and saying that we as a brokerage tried to get around the settlement statement. That's not the risk I'm willing to take. So the other thing with that is, remember, your listing agreement has no spot for that. I haven't even talked to my seller about that. Under the terms of the new listing agreement, we don't even talk about cooperating compensation. There's no spot, there's no mention. So the only way that that's going to be a conversation is if you brought it up, and then you've got to figure out a way that your broker's okay with you advertising it. So that's a whole broker conversation.
If an agent is with their client at an open house, do they need to sign the ONA-SI?
No, that's an agent. They're doing their own thing.
Yeah, a lot of open house question. Open house goers often don't want to sign anything at all. Do you turn them away from the open house? Seems to limit exposure potentially.
Yes and no. If somebody came and knocked on your door tonight and said, I would like to see your house, would you let them in? No. Okay. You're the guardian of that seller's property. If this person really says, I will not sign a form, but I expect to be let to go through this home, maybe that's not the best idea as the guardian of your seller's property. But remember, the listing agreement states that the seller has instructed you to go ahead and either sign an agreement when you're showing the property or get the open house, non-agency SI signed when you're showing the property. It's in there for a reason, because the seller has instructed you. So instead of even making this an issue, you could say the seller requires that everybody sign in prior to entering the home. Okay, they say, I don't care what the seller wants. Well, I'm sorry, but you have an instruction from your seller. So that's what you want to do. You want to honor the seller instruction.
Can you explain how this fits into the code of ethics that the RPA isn't to be used to change offer of seller compensation?
Super glad that you asked that. Okay, remember, it says offer of compensation. That whole world, offers of compensation, they have died. Okay, we're not negotiating our compensation in the purchase agreement. I, as the listing agent, sat down with my seller, and my seller determined what I, as the listing agent, will be paid. Okay. I, as the buyer's agent, sat down with my buyer determined what I, as the buyer's agent, will be paid. Okay. Buyer has a lot of closing costs, right? They've got origination fees on their loan. They have title. They have all that stuff. Okay. Buyer has another cost now that they sat down with me. That is my compensation fee as the buyer's agent. That buyer can always ask the seller to pay anything for them. Let's say the home's in a high fire area. Okay. And the buyer says, well, I'm not doing it because if insurance premiums are too high. They could say, well, okay, I'll buy it if the seller is willing to give me a credit to pay towards that high premium, right? This is the same thing. This buyer is saying, okay, seller, I like your house. I'm super qualified. I'm amazing. Here's a great price. Here's a great offer. I'm going to ask for the following. Buyer asks for a lot of things, right? That things convey, that I want information. Seller has a whole lot of instructions to follow. Buyer's also going to say, and I want you to pay my compensation obligation because I want to bring my closing costs down a bit. That's what's there. Okay.
When we are representing a buyer, should we contact the selling agent to see if the seller is willing to pay the buyer broker compensation?
Cooperating compensation is dead. Okay. Right now it's not. But as soon as it disappears, as soon as the new listing agreement goes out there, remember, the new listing agreement does not even reference that. So should you do that? If you called me and said, is your seller willing to pay cooperating compensation? I'm going to say to you, that concept died. Write your offer, include any terms you want in it, and I will present it to my seller. That's what we do, guys. We don't ask permission to write $5,000 under list. We don't ask permission to, can I include the refrigerator? We write the offer that our buyer wants us to write, and we make it look the best way that we can to be presented to that seller.
Where would we put in the MLS that sellers willing to cooperate with concessions?
Okay. Again, depends on your MLS. If your C.A.R. MLS, there is a field, it's called concessions in price. But other than that, I don't know all the other MLSs. So reach out to your MLS and ask if they're even doing it. Okay. This was a thing that I anticipated all MLSs would do it originally before C.A.R. changed their forms. Now with the change in the forms presentation, I don't know if they'll all do it. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why C.A.R. said it is the default that seller does not instruct the broker to indicate that they'll cooperate with consider offers containing concessions, because they don't know how many MLSs will even have that trigger.
A lot of people are asking where to find these forms. I just posted the link, the C.A.R.org website. When it pops up, there's a button that you can click on for all the latest form updates. And we're 3 minutes out of our 3 o'clock time cutoff.
All right. So last question, unless I talk really fast, so have 2 ready.
So the new RLA will not have a section for buyer's broker compensation to be built into what the seller is willing to pay the buyer's broker.
That's correct. So for those of us that have been around for a long time, we did total compensation. Okay. Right. We picked up that big number. Then couple paragraphs down, then we said this amount of that total compensation shall be offered to the buyer's agent, right? Total compensation is dead. That will not, that's no longer a thing. I will go in, I will say, I'm amazing. This is why you should hire me as your listing agent, and this is what I charge. It's all I'm negotiating. My compensation, okay? The buyer's agent will negotiate their compensation with their buyer, okay? Buyer will either choose to pay that compensation themselves, or buyer will ask the seller to pay their obligation. We only talk to our one client. As brokers, we do not say, I don't say, Holly, what are you going to give me? Okay. It's no longer one big carton of milk that we all have to split. I get my milk, Holly gets her milk.
Like my mouth.
All right, you know what? It's 2:59. So why don't we go ahead and hold it off there? Thank you all for attending. I hope that this was helpful. Really, as I've been out in the field and talking about this and everything, this is a really cool thing. Think about working with buyers. We were always concerned about buyers cheating on us. We never had any real good expectations with them. We really get to go out there. You are a quality individual. Why should you work for an unknown amount? We run businesses. You sit down with your client, you determine what your obligations are, what their obligations are, and how much you get paid. This is a good thing for our industry, but I do know it's a lot of change. If you need anything, please reach out to me. Please be patient. I'll get back to everybody as quickly as I can. The recording will be sent out next week. It will be sent to the email address that you used when you register. If you don't see something in your inbox, please don't email me and tell me that. Just look in your spam or your junk folder, okay? Because that's where it went. So with that, thank you all. I appreciate you and good luck. Bye.